Imagine it's February 2019. You're a middle school teacher named Sandra in suburban Ohio. Every Sunday, you run the same ritual you've run for 12 years. Same grocery store, same aisle route, same cart choreography. Bread, milk, eggs, ground beef, vegetables, maybe cereal for the kids. You know where everything is without looking. It's muscle memory. It's stability. When you reach the register, you already know the number before it appears. Around $140, maybe $150 if you splurge. You don't even think about it. It's background noise, like the electric bill or the mortgage. It exists. It's predictable. It's boring. In a functioning economy, boring is a form of luxury, the ability to plan. Now imagine it's 2024. Same store, same Sunday. Same cart, except you've actually bought less. You skipped the premium cuts. You didn't grab the brand name cereal. You chose the store brand milk. You did everything the responsible consumer is supposed to do. The total flashes on the screen, $270. You stare at it like there's been a mistake. Like a nurse just said your name next to a diagnosis you didn't expect. Not anger first, not even confusion. Something colder. Recognition. The dawning realization that something fundamental has changed, and nobody explained it to you. Here's what I want you to understand today. Sandra is not living through a temporary spike. She isn't caught in a pricing cycle that will mean revert once a few headlines cool down. She is standing at the edge of a permanent structural shift in how food is priced, produced, and distributed in the modern economy. And she isn't going back. Not because corporations are uniquely evil this decade. Not because supply chains are still disrupted. Not because one politician did a bad job and the next one will fix it. But because the architecture of food pricing has been rebuilt around her quietly, mechanically, permanently, and once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. Most people explain grocery inflation with a comforting story. The pandemic disrupted supply chains. Russia invaded Ukraine and grain exports got hit. Energy prices spiked. Labor became expensive. A string of shocks came through the system. Prices rose. And eventually, this is the key, eventually the shocks fade and prices normalize. Economists call this kind of thinking transitory. The idea that we're seeing a deviation from trend that will correct itself. It's the same logic central bankers used in 2021 when inflation began creeping up. Transitory, they said. 18 months later, inflation hit a 40-year high. And the word quietly disappeared from official vocabulary like a bad prediction you delete from your search history. Transitory thinking is comforting because it implies passivity is rational. Just wait. Things will fix themselves. But transitory thinking misses something fundamental about systems. Some shocks don't reverse. Some shocks don't just raise prices. They expose fragilities that were always there. And some shocks create a new equilibrium that the old system cannot return to because the underlying inputs, money, energy, labor, risk, have been permanently repriced. What happened to food prices between 2020 and 2024 is not a temporary deviation. It's a reset. Let me show you why. Starting with the mechanism hiding in plain sight, the one nobody likes talking about because it implicates the entire modern economic order. Money. Between 2020 and 2022, the U.S. monetary base expanded dramatically. Trillions of dollars were created digitally through asset purchases, emergency facilities, and fiscal transfers that were ultimately financed by a monetary backstop. This is public data, not a theory. And here's the part most people don't understand. When new money is created, it does not distribute evenly like rain. It enters through channels. Financial markets first, asset prices respond. Then the money moves into household pockets through stimulus and wages. Then, slowly, it leaks into the real economy, into contracts, into cost structures, into expectations. And money doesn't unhappen. A supply chain bottleneck can unwind. A shipping delay can clear. A war shock can stabilize. But new currency units remain in the system. They circulate, they embed. They become the new baseline. When a meatpacking plant raises wages because workers have more leverage, those wages don't magically fall later. When a trucking company raises rates because fuel and labor surged, those rates get written into contracts. When a grocery chain raises prices to protect margins against rising costs, it rarely lowers them again when costs stabilize. This is the ratchet effect. Prices climb quickly and descend slowly if they descend at all. Because once the nominal price level rises in a permanently expanded money environment, there is no natural mechanism that drags it back down without also dragging the entire economy into contraction. That's the first uncomfortable truth. Your 2019 grocery bill doesn't exist anymore because the 2019 dollars doesn't exist anymore. Not emotionally, not politically, mechanically. History confirms this pattern with brutal consistency. After World War II, the U.S. expanded money supply massively to fund the war effort. When the war ended, prices did not return to pre-war levels. They stabilized at a higher plateau. The old price world died. The new one became normal. After 1971, when the dollar severed its link to gold and the Bretton Woods system collapsed, the purchasing power of the dollar entered a one-way decline. It didn't reverse. The unit of account was repriced permanently. So if this were only about money creation, you might expect all prices to rise roughly uniformly. But food rose faster than overall inflation. Eggs spiked violently. Beef rose sharply. Butter surged. Food at home climbed above the headline measures people like to quote. Why? Because food sits at the intersection of multiple compounding systems. Money is just the first layer. Underneath it are four more structural forces that don't reverse neatly: energy, consolidation, labor, and climate adaptation. And in the next section, we're going to walk through those mechanisms one by one. Because once you see how modern food is made not as farming, but as industrial, chemistry and logistics, you understand why the old world of cheap calories was not guaranteed. It was a temporary arrangement, and that arrangement is ending. To understand why your grocery bill won't go back to normal, you need to understand a basic truth we've been trained to forget. Modern food is not grown. It is manufactured. Not in the sense that it's fake, though sometimes it is, but in the sense that every calorie you eat is shaped by industrial inputs: energy, fertilizer, machinery, packaging, refrigeration, and global logistics. A grocery store is not a farm stand. It's the final node in a supply network that depends on cheap fuel, cheap credit, and predictable climate. And all three of those assumptions have fractured. Let's start with energy, because energy is the invisible ingredient in almost everything you buy. The energy floor. Every calorie is powered by fuel. Agriculture today is applied chemistry. Nitrogen fertilizer, one of the foundations of modern crop yields, is produced through the Haber-Bosch process, which requires enormous energy inputs, primarily natural gas. Tractors and combines run on diesel. Grain dryers run on gas. Trucks and shipping move food on diesel. Refrigeration runs on electricity. Plastic packaging is petroleum. So when energy prices rise, food prices rise. That part is obvious. The part that matters is what's structural. The era of cheap energy, cheap enough to act like a permanent subsidy for modern agriculture's ending. From roughly the mid-1980s through 2020, energy markets operated in a relatively stable range. Global supply management, shale expansion, and investment cycles created a long period where energy-intensive industries could build their cost structures around cheap fuel. It wasn't perfectly stable, but the floor felt low enough that nobody redesigned the system for scarcity. Then the assumptions broke. Investment in new oil and gas production fell sharply for years. Many projects take 5 to 10 years to come online, which means the supply gap created by underinvestment doesn't show up immediately. It shows up later like a delayed fuse. At the same time, extraction gets harder. Easy production has already been tapped in many basins. Costs rise. Productivity declines in older areas. And even when prices come down from a spike, the system often settles at a higher baseline than before because the marginal barrel becomes more expensive. The result is not constant crisis. The result is a higher energy pricing floor. And that floor is built into every input cost in food. This is why food inflation is stubborn, even when headlines calm down. Because a calm headline doesn't resurrect cheap energy. Consolidation. The food system isn't a free market. Now we add the second force. And this one is purely structural. Consolidation. The American food system is not a wide-open competitive battlefield where thousands of firms fight for your dollar. It is an oligopoly. A small number of firms dominate processing, distribution, and retail. In beef processing, a handful of corporations control the majority of capacity. In pork and chicken, similar concentration exists. In grocery retail, a small group of giants controls an enormous share of sales. In food distribution, a few players handle a huge fraction of what moves from factory to shelf. This matters because consolidation changes how prices behave. In a competitive market, when input costs rise, prices rise, but competition forces price restraint. If one firm raises prices too much, consumers shift to competitors. In a consolidated market, firms don't need to fight aggressively on price. They don't even need explicit collusion. They simply observe each other and learn that price wars destroy margins for everyone. So the industry drifts into parallel pricing behavior, what economists call tacit coordination. When costs rise, prices rise fast. When costs fall, prices don't fall the same way. Margins expand. That becomes a permanent feature of the system. So even if fuel prices stabilize, even if supply chains improve, the consumer doesn't necessarily get the benefit because market power captures the slack. This is not a moral claim. It's mechanical. The system has fewer competitors, the system has more pricing power. And pricing power is sticky. The ratchet effect. Prices climb like an elevator, descend like stairs. Now combine the first and second mechanisms, higher energy floors, and consolidated market power. And you get what people experience as the new normal. Prices move upward quickly and downward slowly, if ever. This is the ratchet pricing effect. A store raises prices because costs rose. Then costs stabilize. But the store doesn't need to drop prices aggressively because the consumer has limited alternatives and the whole industry move together. So the price becomes the baseline. And once the baseline is established, it becomes psychologically easier to maintain than to reverse. Because lowering prices means giving up margin. Raising prices can always be justified by some part of the supply network being stressed. This is why grocery inflation feels permanent. Because the system has learned it can make it permanent. The historical echo. Price levels don't go back. History is ruthless about this. After major monetary expansions and major supply repricings, prices stabilize at new plateaus. They rarely return to old worlds unless you get deflation. Deflation is not a gentle correction. It is economic trauma. It is defaults, unemployment, collapsing asset values, and social unrest. So policymakers avoid it. Businesses avoid it. And the system drifts into the new level. Meaning even if the inflation rate slows, meaning prices rise more slowly, the price level stays elevated. That is what most people misunderstand. They think inflation coming down means prices coming down. It doesn't. It means the speed of increase slows. The higher plateau remains. Now, if energy and consolidation were the whole story, food would still be expensive, but the market might gradually settle. But food has two more structural forces pushing it higher: labor repricing and climate adaptation, and both are stubborn. In the next section, we'll look at why wages in food supply chains don't revert, why labor shortages became permanent leverage, how climate volatility is embedding new costs year after year, and why these pressures compound instead of cancel out. Because food doesn't sit on one system, it sits at the intersection of 5, and every one of them has shifted. Now we reach the part where the system stops behaving like a normal market and starts behaving like a permanent squeeze. Because money creation lifted the price level. Energy repricing raised the floor. Consolidation gave corporations the power to hold the new baseline. But none of that fully explains why food prices rose faster than overall inflation and why they keep feeling sticky even when the panic headlines fade. The answer is that food sits in a uniquely unforgiving intersection of human labor and physical climate. You can swap suppliers for microchips. You can outsource customer support. You can digitize services. But you cannot digitize harvesting, refrigeration, meat processing, and last mile, grocery stocking at scale without still needing human bodies doing physical work. And once those bodies gain leverage, the cost structure shifts permanently. Labor. The cost that doesn't reverse between 2020 and 2023. The labor market for food supply roles changed in ways that are still echoing. Start with pandemic reality. Meatpacking plants became hotspots. Warehouses became pressure cookers. Grocery stores became frontline spaces. Workers quit, slowed production, demanded hazard pay, demanded better conditions. At the same time, immigration tightening and demographic trends constrained labor supply in many of the roles agriculture and processing rely on. Then stimulus and expanded benefits created something rare for low-wage workers: breathing room. For the first time in years, many workers had the ability to say no to the worst conditions. In a tight labor market, employers conceded. Wages rose. And here's the key rule that makes this structural: wages are sticky downward. One of the most robust findings in labor economics is that wages rise far more easily than they fall. Workers accept smaller raises. They resist pay cuts with fury. Employers understand this. They avoid nominal wage cuts because wage cuts break morale, increase turnover, and create labor conflict. So once wages rise in a labor-intensive sector, the new wage becomes the baseline. It embeds into contracts and expectations. A food manufacturer that raised hourly pay from, say, the high teens to the low 20s cannot casually roll it back because inflation cooled. The workforce doesn't unlearn what leverage feels like. That means higher labor costs are now baked into meat processing, warehouse operations, trucking and logistics, retail, stocking and checkout, food manufacturing, and because those roles sit inside nearly every link of the chain, labor becomes a permanent markup on your entire grocery bill. This is why even a stabilized supply chain still feels expensive. The workers aren't going back to 2019 pricing, because their rent didn't go back either. Climate adaptation, the invisible tax that compounds forever. Now we add the second structural force, and this one is even more unforgiving because it isn't negotiated in boardrooms. It is dictated by physics. Climate volatility is restructuring where and how food can be grown, not in some abstract 2050 projection way, in a practical cost of business way. Take the Western United States and agricultural engine for fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Chronic water stress changes what can be planted, how much land is productive, and what it costs to irrigate. When water becomes scarce, farms drill deeper wells, pay more for water rights, shift crops, or simply fallow land. Every adaptation costs money, and that money becomes price. In the Colorado River Basin, reservoir levels and allocation conflicts don't just create political drama. They create rising costs that get passed into the food you buy. It's the same with California drought patterns, wildfire impacts, and growing season volatility. The cost isn't only lost output, it's risk management. Now look at the Midwest, the corn and soybean belt. Changing precipitation patterns are altering planting windows, increasing flood events in some areas and drought stress in others. That increases yield variability, which increases price volatility. And then there's the global system. The modern food trade is globalized. Grain, rice, fertilizer inputs, feedstocks, everything flows across borders. Extreme weather events now disrupt exports and production more frequently. Monsoons, droughts, floods, heat waves. When a major exporter restricts trade to protect domestic supply, global prices spike. Even if you live in Ohio, you're plugged into that global price formation. This isn't a moral argument about climate politics. It's an accounting argument. Volatility adds cost, and adaptation adds cost. Because you don't just produce food anymore. You produce food under stress. And stress is expensive. The five-force trap, why no lever, brings prices back now. We name the constraint clearly. The food system has experienced a simultaneous shift across 5 dimensions. Monetary expansion permanently diluted the unit of account. Energy repricing raised the cost floor of every input. Consolidation removed competitive pressure and made price stickiness structural. Labor repricing embedded higher wages into every link of the chain. Climate adaptation created compounding, ongoing risk costs. None of these are temporary. None of these reverse naturally. And they don't cancel each other out, they compound. This is why no politician can bring prices back to 2019 to reverse the price level. You'd need some combination of deflationary contraction and cost reversion across multiple sectors. But deflation is economic trauma. Central banks avoid it because it destroys debt structures and asset markets. Energy doesn't revert without long-cycle investment and geology cooperating. Consolidation doesn't unwind without years of antitrust action and political will. Wages don't fall without social conflict. Climate volatility doesn't reverse on human timescales. So the machine locks in the new equilibrium. This is what Sandra is feeling at the register, not chaos. A new settlement. But now we have to talk about the psychological and political consequences. Because food inflation isn't just an economic statistic, it's politically radioactive. Not because groceries are the biggest expense for most households, they aren't. But because groceries are the most visible, frequent, and emotionally charged expense. You feel them weekly. You can't postpone them. You can't unsubscribe. The pain repeats 52 times a year. It accumulates into anger. And when anger meets a system with no easy lever, governments reach for the oldest tricks: price controls, subsidies, scapegoats, investigations. History has seen those plays before. In the next section, we'll explore adaptation behavior store brands, discount retailers. Shrinkflation: why companies hide inflation when they can. Why that concealment is reaching its limit. And why food inflation functions like a regressive tax that reshapes society over time. Because this isn't just about a higher receipt. It's about what happens to trust when the most basic thing in life becomes permanently more expensive, and the system tells you it's normal. When people talk about inflation, they often talk like it's weather. A storm passed through the economy. Prices rose. Eventually, the clouds clear. But food inflation isn't weather. It's gravity. It's the kind of pressure you feel constantly because you can't avoid it. You can postpone buying a couch. You can delay a vacation. You can even delay replacing a car. You can't delay eating. And that's why rising grocery prices hit the public psyche differently than rising stock prices or even rising rents. Rent hurts once a month. Food hurts every week. It's repetitive. It's intimate. It forces you to confront decline in small humiliations. Thinner carts, fewer brands, fewer choices. So the public adapts. Not happily, not proudly, out of necessity. And the pattern of adaptation tells you something profound about where the system is headed. The first adaptation: downshifting store brands, discount chains, and smaller baskets. You can see the shift everywhere. Private label products store brands gain share because households try to regain control. Discount grocers expand because the middle class starts shopping like the working class. People who once treated Aldi as a cheap option now treat it like the rational choice. Families switch from premium cuts to cheaper proteins. They buy more frozen food. They cook at home more. They substitute ingredients. They search unit prices like accountants because grocery shopping has become budgeting warfare. But here's the problem. These adaptations have limits. Store brands still rely on the same energy inputs, the same consolidated processors, the same labor costs, the same climate volatility. Switching from a name brand to a private label might save you 15 to 25%. It doesn't save you 60%. So adaptation buys time, not reversal. It makes the higher price plateau livable, but it does not bring the old world back. The second adaptation: shrinkflation. The inflation you don't see until it's too late. This is where the system reveals its psychological intelligence. Companies know that explicit price hikes trigger anger, so they hide the increase. They keep the sticker price stable, but quietly reduce the product size. A cereal box is smaller. A chip bag is lighter. An ice cream pint becomes a shape-shifted container that isn't a pint anymore. Toilet paper rolls are thinner. The shelf looks normal. Your receipt looks normal. But your unit price rises. Shrinkflation accelerated after 2020 because it exploits a cognitive weakness. Consumers notice price jumps faster than they notice quantity reductions. It preserves the illusion of stability while extracting more per ounce. But here's the thing about shrinkflation: it can't run forever. Eventually, the product becomes absurd. A bag becomes mostly air. A container becomes comically small. Consumers notice. The illusion breaks. And once shrinkflation hits the physical limit of packaging practicality, companies return to explicit price hikes. Which means the next phase isn't prices coming down. It's prices going up openly, staying there. The political reality: governments hate food inflation and mostly fail against it. Food inflation is politically radioactive because it collapses narratives. You can blame high gas prices on foreign oil producers. You can blame high rents on landlords. You can blame high interest rates on central banks. But food inflation is ambient. It's everywhere. It feels personal. It triggers deep fear because it touches survival, not comfort. So governments reach for the oldest tools, price controls. They sound heroic. They are almost always disastrous. History doesn't just warn against them, it documents their predictable outcomes. When governments cap prices below real production cost, producers reduce supply. Shortages emerge. Black markets form. The policy helps on paper while collapsing availability in practice. The system breaks at the point where reality refuses to obey legislation. Subsidies. These already exist in agriculture. Subsidies can soften certain price spikes, but they don't eliminate the structural drivers: energy, labor, climate, consolidation. They simply shift who pays. The cost appears in taxes or debt. And debt eventually loops back into inflation. Scapegoats and investigations. Politicians hold hearings, threaten big grocers, talk about greed. Sometimes greed is real, but greed isn't a mechanism. Market structure is. If the industry is consolidated, pricing power exists whether anyone is evil or not. So politics runs in circles while the system continues operating. That's why the public feels gaslit. They hear promises about bringing prices down, but they live in a system where price levels don't revert without economic pain. Politicians refuse to trigger. Who pays food inflation as a regressive tax? Now we name the harsh truth. Food inflation behaves like a regressive tax. A household with low income spends a much larger share of income on essentials: food, housing, energy. When food rises, it eats into necessities. When a wealthy household faces food inflation, it cuts luxuries. For poorer households, the cut can be protein, nutrition, variety, health. This isn't philosophical, it's math. It is also why food inflation reshapes society quietly. Nutrition declines at the margins. Health outcomes worsen over time. Stress rises, household tensions rise. Social trust erodes because people feel the system has broken the most basic promise. Full-time work should buy stable life. And history shows what happens when that promise breaks. Not always revolution, sometimes stagnation, sometimes polarization, sometimes a slow erosion of faith that ends in unpredictable political events. Food inflation doesn't need to cause famine to destabilize a society. It just needs to make people feel that the future is shrinking. Now, at this point, a hopeful person will ask, what about technology? Vertical farms, lab-grown meat, AI logistics, automation. Won't innovation bring costs down? Innovation will help, but it won't reverse the structural shift quickly enough to recreate 2019. Many of these technologies face brutal cost ceilings. Energy intensity, capital requirements, regulatory friction, consumer acceptance, and time. They may change the margins. They may change the long run. But they will not teleport grocery prices back to the old plateau, because the old plateau was built on conditions that no longer exist. So we arrive at the final conclusion. What does this mean for Sandra? For you? For everyone watching their cart shrink while their receipt grows? In the next section, we'll close the loop. Why the old return to normal story is psychologically comforting, but mechanically false. What a new equilibrium actually means for living standards. And why the adaptation you're doing now, store brands, fewer luxuries, more home cooking, is not temporary. It's your life adjusting to a system that has already changed. And the only question left is whether you see the architecture before it shapes you completely. Let's be precise about what your grocery bill will never go back to normal actually means. It doesn't mean prices will rise forever at the same speed. Inflation rates can slow. Some items can dip. Seasonal patterns still exist. Supply shocks still come and go. But the price level, the plateau you live on, has moved upward. And once a price level moves upward because the unit of account was diluted, because energy was repriced, because labor was reset, because climate volatility became a cost input, and because consolidated industries gained the power to hold margins, that plateau doesn't come back down without something that feels like collapse. The mechanism that returns prices to 2019 would be deflation. And deflation is not a gentle refund from the universe. Deflation is layoffs, bankruptcies, asset crashes, debt defaults. A hard contraction that politicians, central banks, and businesses will fight with everything they have because the modern economy is built on debt. Structures that require nominal growth to remain stable. So even if inflation slows, the new level remains. That is the trap of modern economics. The speed can change, but the height stays. And the human brain keeps hoping height will change because we confuse inflation cooling with prices falling. But cooling is not reversal. It is just slower ascent. This is why promises to bring prices back down rarely materialize. The system can cool the fire, but it cannot restore the burned forest. Now, let's return to Sandra, because she represents millions. Sandra still goes to the same grocery store every Sunday, but she's not the same shopper. In 2019, she grabbed what she wanted. She didn't think in unit prices. She didn't calculate ounces. She didn't compare the psychological cost of chicken thighs versus chicken breasts. In 2024 and beyond, she does. She scans the shelf like a negotiator. She buys more private label. She buys less variety. She has a mental list of things we used to buy that are now off-limits now because the family suddenly stopped liking them. But because the household budget no longer tolerates them. This shift is not temporary. It is adaptive. It is the new arrangement between income and essentials. And children growing up in that new arrangement will consider it normal, because humans normalize almost anything if it repeats enough times. That's how societies absorb structural change, not in one dramatic moment, but in daily rituals quietly rewritten. What you are seeing is the beginning of an adaptation era, not a panic era. In the adaptation era, store brands become default. Discount chains gain market share. Bulk buying replaces convenience. Home cooking replaces eating out. Variety shrinks. Nutrition trade-offs become routine. Households run tighter, with less slack and less margin for error. And this matters because slack is what makes a society resilient. A society with slack can absorb layoffs, sickness, disruptions, and still function. A society without slack becomes brittle. Small shocks become big crises. That's why the permanent rise in food costs isn't just a consumer annoyance. It changes the psychological weather of a country. It increases anxiety. It increases resentment. It makes people feel the system is slipping out of their control because, in the most literal sense, it is. Now, let's zoom out and name the deeper pattern. The 5 forces aren't going away. The mechanisms that drove the reset are not reversing. Money dilution. The unit of account was permanently expanded. And no central bank is going to unprint that without detonating asset markets. Energy floor. Even if you see dips, the marginal cost structure of global energy is higher than in the cheap energy era that subsidized modern food. Consolidation. Oligopolies don't voluntarily give up pricing power. Labor repricing. Wages in essential physical industries rarely revert downward. Climate adaptation. Volatility adds costs for every irrigation, insurance, risk management, disruptions, rebuilding. None of these are temporary supply chain issues. They are structural. And together, they form an interlocking system that holds grocery prices at a higher equilibrium. Why politics can't fix it cleanly, governments can fight symptoms. They can hold hearings. They can threaten price controls. They can subsidize. They can investigate. But they cannot rebuild the entire architecture quickly. They can't legislate cheaper energy into existence overnight. They can't unwind decades of consolidation without years of antitrust wars. They can't cut wages without social conflict. They can't reverse climate volatility in a budget cycle. So what they often do instead is manage perception, make promises, blame villains, offer targeted relief checks. Expand nutrition support, adjust tax credits. These may help households survive, and that matters. But they don't bring the plateau back down. They simply help people stand on the higher plateau without falling off. The historical rhyme history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. In the 1970s stagflation era, American families adapted. They bought smaller cars. They changed diets. They shifted consumption patterns. Those changes became permanent cultural norms. The world after that inflationary era did not revert to the world before it. That's what happens after major repricings. A new culture forms around the new constraints. And we are now entering a similar phase. The adaptation you're doing today, buying differently, eating differently, living tighter's not a temporary response to a weird period. It is the formation of a new baseline, a new normal. Not the normal you remember. The normal your children will treat as background noise. So, to be clear, I'm not saying the United States is heading toward famine. It isn't. This isn't Weimar. This isn't Venezuela. The issue is not availability. The system can produce enough food. The issue is purchasing power. The issue is that a given income now buys less stability than it did. And once that relationship shifts, it doesn't reset without pain so severe that society usually chooses to adapt instead. That's what Sandra is doing. That's what you're doing. Not because you want to, because the system has already moved. And this is the point where most people stop asking why and just accept the new arrangement as reality. But if you understand the architecture, money dilution, energy, consolidation, labor, climate too, stop seeing grocery prices as random bad luck. You see them as the outcome of systems designed for conditions that no longer exist. This channel exists to map those systems before they become headlines, to trace the mechanisms beneath the symptoms, to show you the terrain so you can navigate it with clearer eyes. Most people experience economic shifts as weather. It rains, they get wet, they wait for sun. But this isn't weather, it's climate, and the climate has changed.